What if winning a war was the worst mistake you could ever make? What if the single greatest moment of your life, the act of genius that saved your nation and ended a decade of bloodshed, was the very thing that condemned you to 10 more years of unimaginable horror? This isn't a riddle. This is the story of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, the hero of the Trojan War. We all know the story of the Trojan horse, a brilliant trick, a wooden beast filled with soldiers that brought the impenetrable city of Troy to its knees. But we've been told the story wrong. That horse wasn't just a clever strategy. It was an act of supreme arrogance, an insult so profound it echoed in the halls of Mount Olympus. Odysseus didn't just trick the Trojans, he mocked the gods themselves. He declared that he, a mere mortal, had won the war through his own cunning, not through their divine favor. And for that, the gods would make him pay. They wouldn't just kill him. That would be too easy. Instead, they would strip him of everything he held dear. His men, his ships, his name, and his mind. They would force him on a 10-year Odyssey so brutal it would become a legend. A journey designed not just to punish him, but to break him. But here is the question that the original story never fully answers. A question that has haunted scholars for centuries. Was this journey really a punishment? Or was it a test? A crucible forged by the gods to see if a mortal man, through suffering and loss, could become something more than human. The answer lies hidden within his 10-year voyage home. And by the end of this journey, you will understand the terrifying truth of what the gods truly wanted from him. The city of Troy was a sea of flames. 10 years of siege, of death, of prayers that went unanswered, had finally come to an end. The Greek kings, victorious and drunk on vengeance, plundered the fallen city. They defiled temples, slaughtered innocents, and committed atrocities that would stain their names for eternity. Among them was Odysseus, the mastermind, the man they called Polytropos, the man of twists and turns. But as he stood on the deck of his ship, the shores of Troy burning behind him, he felt no joy, only a deep gnawing ache. The ache for home, for Ithaca, his rocky island kingdom, for his wife Penelope, whose intelligence was a match for his own, and for his son Telemachus, who was just an infant when he left and was now a young man he didn't even know. With a fleet of 12 black-sailed ships and a loyal crew of his countrymen, Odysseus set a course for home. The wind was at their backs. The mood was euphoric. They were heroes, conquerors, heading home to riches and glory. Their first stop was a city on the coast of Thrace, the land of the Cyclones. And here the rot began to set in. The war had changed these men. They were no longer just sailors and farmers, they were killers. Intoxicated by the easy victory at Troy, their greed took over. Odysseus ordered a tactical raid. Strike fast, take supplies, and leave. But his men, their hands still stained with Trojan blood, refused to listen. They saw a city ripe for the picking. They stormed the gates, plundered the homes, and slaughtered the men who stood in their way. They feasted on the Cyclones cattle and drank their wine until they were senseless, ignoring Odysseus's frantic commands to return to the ships. They had forgotten how to be anything but soldiers, and their arrogance was met with swift, brutal justice. As the sun rose, an army of Cyclones from inland, alerted by the survivors, descended upon the drunken, sleeping Greeks. The battle on the beach was a massacre. Surprised and outnumbered, Odysseus's men were cut down where they stood. They fought with the desperation of cornered animals, but it was no use. For every Cyclones they killed, 2 more took his place. Odysseus, a brilliant general, managed to rally the survivors and fight his way back to the ships, but the cost was devastating. 6 men from each of his 12 ships were lost, 72 warriors dead. Not in the glorious Trojan War, but in a pointless, greedy raid. As they pushed off from the blood-soaked shore, the triumphant cheers were gone, replaced by the wails of men mourning their fallen comrades. It was their first taste of divine retribution, a warning. They had acted like pirates, not heroes, and the gods had taken notice. Zeus, king of the gods, unleashed a storm of unimaginable fury. For 9 straight days, a hurricane-force wind tore at their sails and battered their hulls, blowing them far off course, into uncharted waters, beyond the edge of the known world. The men huddled together, cold, terrified, convinced they were doomed to perish in the churning abyss. On the 10th day, the storm finally broke, and they drifted ashore on a strange, tranquil island. The air was warm, the light was soft, and the land was covered in a single hypnotic plant, the lotus. This was the land of the lotus eaters. The inhabitants were not hostile. They were gentle, smiling, and seemed to exist in a state of blissful peace. They approached Odysseus's men and offered them the fruit of the island, their only food. It was sweet, intoxicating, and utterly deadly. Odysseus sent 3 of his men to scout the island. Hours passed. They didn't return. Worried, Odysseus went after them himself, and what he found chilled him to the bone. His men were alive, sitting among the lotus eaters, their faces vacant, their eyes glazed over with a serene, empty happiness. They were eating the honey-sweet fruit, and with every bite, their memories were dissolving like mist. They had forgotten the Trojan War. They had forgotten the Sicanies. They had forgotten their shipmates, their families, their homes. They had forgotten their own names. The lotus fruit didn't kill the body. It erased the soul. It offered an end to all suffering, a paradise of perfect apathy. It was the ultimate temptation, the chance to simply give up, to forget the pain of the past and the struggle of the future, and to just exist. When his men saw Odysseus, they didn't recognize him. They smiled their empty smiles and offered him the fruit. He looked into their eyes and saw nothing. All ambition, all love, all longing for home gone, replaced by a placid void. In a panic, Odysseus realized the true danger of this place. It wasn't a monster that could be fought with a sword, but an idea that could poison the heart. He grabbed his 3 men, who began to weep and struggle, begging to be left in their newfound paradise. He had to physically drag them, kicking and screaming, back to the ship. He tied them beneath the rowing benches, forcing them to endure the agonizing withdrawal from the plant's magic. He then ordered the rest of his crew to board the ships immediately, warning them not to even touch the shore, lest they too forget their purpose. With his 3 zombified scouts still crying for the lotus, they rowed away with all their might, fleeing the island of blissful oblivion. They had survived greed. They had survived despair. They had narrowly escaped the death of the soul. Now, adrift once more on an unknown sea, they were battered, demoralized, and running desperately low on food and water. Then through the haze they saw it. Another island. This one looked different. It was lush, green, and beautiful. Wild goats roamed the hills and fresh springs trickled down from the mountains. It seemed untouched, a perfect sanctuary sent by the gods to replenish their supplies and their spirits. As they sailed closer, they saw a large cave overlooking the bay, a wisp of smoke curling from its entrance. It looked like the home of a simple shepherd, a place of peace. But Odysseus, the man of twists and turns, felt a deep sense of unease. This island was too perfect, too quiet. He didn't know it yet, but he was sailing directly into a trap. He was about to come face to face with a creature of ancient, monstrous power, a being who would not only test his legendary cleverness, but would also earn him the undying hatred of one of the most powerful gods on Olympus. The nightmare was only just beginning, and that nightmare took the form of an island. From the sea, it looked like a paradise, lush and green, with wild goats grazing on the hillsides. A perfect place to restock and recover. Odysseus, ever the cautious leader, took 1 ship and a small scouting party of 12 of his best men to explore. He also brought along a gift, a goatskin of incredibly strong, unmixed wine, a treasure given to him on his last stop, a little something to offer a potential host, a gesture of peace. They found a cave, a massive one, clearly the home of someone, or something of great size. It was empty, but it was filled with signs of life. Giant pens of lambs and goats, huge buckets of whey, and racks of enormous cheeses. His men, their nerves still shot from the Sicanies and the lotus eaters, begged him to take some cheese and lambs and leave immediately. They had a bad feeling about this place, but Odysseus refused. His curiosity, his fatal flaw, got the better of him. He wanted to see who lived here. He wanted to meet the owner, to receive a guest gift. A sacred tradition in the ancient world where a host bestows a gift upon their visitor. So they waited. And that was the single worst decision of his life up to that point. As dusk fell, a shadow fell over the mouth of the cave. The ground trembled. A creature of immense size, a Cyclops with a single massive eye in the center of his forehead, drove his flock of sheep into the cave. This was Polyphemus. He wasn't just a giant. He was a son of Poseidon, the god of the sea, and he had no time for human traditions. He sealed the entrance of the cave with a boulder so massive that 24 horses couldn't have moved it. The men were trapped. The firelight flickered across the giant's face as his single eye scanned the terrified Greeks huddled in the corner. He didn't ask who they were or where they came from. He asked if they were pirates. Odysseus, trying to keep his voice from shaking, appealed to the laws of the gods, the laws of hospitality. He explained they were Greeks, returning from Troy, and that Zeus himself protected guests and travelers. Polyphemus just laughed, a deep rumbling sound that shook the very stones. "We Cyclopes," he boomed, "care nothing for your Zeus. We are stronger than any god." And to prove his point, he reached out, snatched up 2 of Odysseus's men, and smashed their heads against the rock floor like you or I might crack an egg. He then tore them limb from limb and ate them, bones and all, washing them down with milk. The remaining men could only watch in silent, abject horror. This wasn't a battle. This was a slaughter. They were trapped in a monster's pantry. Odysseus was paralyzed. His first instinct was to draw his sword and charge, to plunge it into the giant's gut as he slept. But his mind, his greatest weapon, stopped him. He realized that even if he could kill the Cyclops, they would still be trapped. They could never move the boulder from the door. They would simply starve to death in the monster's tomb. He had to think. He had to be cleverer than he had ever been in his life. The next morning, the Cyclops woke, ate 2 more men for breakfast, and then rolled the stone away just enough to let his flock out to pasture before sealing it again, whistling as he went. He left Odysseus and his remaining crew to marinate in their despair. But despair is not in Odysseus's nature. He saw a massive club the Cyclops was seasoning by the fire, a piece of an olive tree as big as a ship's mast. While the giant was gone, Odysseus and his men sharpened the tip of it into a deadly point and then hardened it in the fire. They hid the giant's stake under a pile of dung. When Polyphemus returned that evening and devoured 2 more men for dinner, Odysseus put his plan into motion. He approached the giant, holding the goatskin of wine. He offered it as a gift, suggesting it would go nicely with his meal of human flesh. The Cyclops had never tasted wine before. He drank it down greedily, demanding more. 3 times he drained the bowl, the potent, unwatered wine going straight to his head. He grew cheerful, almost friendly. He asked Odysseus his name, promising him a special guest gift in return. And here Odysseus's genius shines. He doesn't give his real name. That would be suicide. Instead, he says, "My name is Nobody." The drunken Cyclops laughed. "All right, Nobody. Here is my gift to you. I will eat you last, after I have eaten all of your friends." And with that he crashed onto the floor, passed out from the wine. This was their chance. Odysseus and his men retrieved the giant's stake. They heated the tip in the fire until it was glowing red-hot. Then, with a prayer to the gods for strength, they gathered all their courage, lifted the massive beam together, and drove the burning point directly into the Cyclops' single sleeping eye. The sound was hideous, a sizzling hiss like a blacksmith plunging hot metal into cold water. The giant's eye exploded. Polyphemus awoke with a scream of agony that echoed through the mountains. He ripped the smoking stake from his face and began thrashing around the cave, blind and furious, roaring in pain. His cries alerted the other Cyclopes on the island, who gathered outside the boulder. "What's wrong, Polyphemus?" they shouted. "Who is hurting you?" And through his roars of pain, Polyphemus screamed the answer Odysseus had given him. "Nobody is hurting me. Nobody is killing me by treachery." His brothers, confused and annoyed, simply shrugged. "Well," they said, "if nobody is hurting you, then it must be a sickness from the gods. You should pray to your father Poseidon." And they left. The plan had worked. The trap was set, and the monster had walked right into it. But they still weren't free. The blind, enraged Polyphemus was now sitting by the entrance, blocking the way, running his massive hands over the backs of his sheep as he let them out to pasture, determined to catch any man trying to sneak past. This required one final brilliant move. Odysseus took the giant rams of the flock and lashed them together in sets of 3. He then tied one of his men under the belly of the middle ram in each set, shielded by the other 2. For himself, he chose the largest, strongest ram in the entire flock and clung to the thick wool of its underside. As the morning came, the sheep moved toward the entrance. The Cyclops, true to his word, felt the back of each animal as it passed. He felt the thick fleece, but he never thought to check underneath. One by one, Odysseus's men slipped through the monster's grasp. When the final ram, the one carrying Odysseus, passed by, Polyphemus paused. He spoke to the ram, his favorite, wondering why it was lagging behind when it was usually the first out of the cave. He mused that perhaps the ram was grieving for its master's lost eye. And then he let it pass. Odysseus was free. They scrambled to their ship, untied the moorings, and pushed off into the sea, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and triumph. They had done it. They had survived. And this is where Odysseus, the master of cunning, the patient strategist, makes a catastrophic mistake. He is overcome by pride, by hubris. He can't just escape. He has to win. He has to let the monster know who beat him. From the deck of his ship, just out of throwing range, he cups his hands and yells back to the shore, taunting the blind giant, mocking his stupidity. Polyphemus, hearing the voice, flew into a rage. He ripped the top off a mountain and hurled it at the ship. The massive rock landed just in front of the bow, and the resulting wave nearly washed them back onto the shore. His men screamed at him, begged him to be quiet, to just sail away. But Odysseus couldn't help himself. He had to have the last word. He yelled again, this time revealing the one piece of information that would seal his doom for the next decade. If anyone asks who blinded you, he roared, tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes from Ithaca. He had given the monster his name. And that was all Polyphemus needed. The blind Cyclops staggered to the edge of the sea, raised his hands to the sky, and prayed to his father Poseidon, the god of earthquakes and oceans. He prayed that Odysseus would never reach his home. But if he was fated to return, he prayed that he would return late, a broken man, having lost all his companions on a foreign ship, only to find a world of pain waiting for him in his own house. And Poseidon, the mighty ruler of the sea, heard his son's prayer. Odysseus had outsmarted a monster, but in his pride, he had just given the god of the sea a name, a target, and a reason for vengeance that would follow him across every last mile of the ocean. The wind, once their ally, now whipped against them with a malevolent intelligence. The sea, once a simple pathway, now churned with a deep personal grudge. Every wave that crashed over the bow felt less like nature and more like a punch from an angry god. For 10 days they sailed under this new curse, fighting for every inch, until they spotted a strange floating island, completely encased in a wall of unbreakable bronze. This was Aeolia, the home of Aeolus, the divine keeper of the winds. Aeolus was a man favored by the gods, a king who literally held the power of the weather in his hands. He welcomed Odysseus and his crew, treating them like long-lost family. For a solid month they feasted and rested, and Odysseus, the master storyteller, recounted his entire epic tale of the Trojan War. Aeolus was captivated. He was so impressed by Odysseus's cunning and endurance that he decided to give him the greatest gift a sailor could ever ask for: a shortcut home. He took a large oxhide bag and, using his divine power, he trapped every single violent, stormy wind inside it. The gales, the squalls, the hurricanes. He sealed the bag tight with a silver cord and told Odysseus not to open it under any circumstances. Then he summoned a gentle west wind, the Zephyr, to blow steadily and push their ships directly toward Ithaca. It was the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. A straight shot home, no storms allowed. For 9 days and 9 nights the plan worked perfectly. Odysseus himself manned the rudder, never sleeping, his eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to trust this perfect gift to anyone else. The west wind was so steady, so perfect, that on the 10th day they saw it. Home. The rocky shores of Ithaca, so close they could see the smoke rising from the hearts of their own villages. They could make out the shapes of shepherds tending their flocks. They were there. And in that moment of triumph, with victory in his grasp, exhaustion finally claimed Odysseus. He collapsed into a deep sleep, but his men had been watching that bag the whole time. They saw the special treatment Aeolus gave their king. They felt the weight of it. And their minds, poisoned by greed and jealousy, started to churn. They began whispering to each other, convinced that Aeolus hadn't given Odysseus a bag of winds, but a treasure trove of gold and silver. They felt cheated. They had fought the same war, faced the same monsters, and what did they have to show for it? While their king was about to return home a rich man, they would arrive with empty hands. Their resentment boiled over. As Odysseus slept, mere yards from his own shoreline, his men untied the silver cord. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. All the trapped winds of the world exploded from the bag in a single furious tempest. A hurricane of divine power erupted, spinning the ships around and blasting them backward, away from Ithaca, back out into the open, unforgiving sea. Odysseus woke to the screams of his men and the splintering of wood, his heart shattering as he watched the shores of his home disappear once more into the horizon. He was so filled with despair he considered simply throwing himself overboard and ending it all. But the survivor in him, the man who refused to be broken, took over. He wrapped himself in his cloak and simply endured the failure, the shame of being betrayed by his own men, and the agony of having home ripped away at the last possible second. The storm blew them right back to Aeolus' floating island, but this time there was no welcome. Aeolus took one look at them and knew exactly what had happened. He was furious. He saw them not as unlucky sailors, but as men cursed by the gods. To help them again would be to invite the wrath of the heavens upon himself. He cast them out, screaming that they were the most detested men on earth, and that he would offer them no more aid. So they set sail again with no divine help, their spirits utterly crushed. They rowed for 6 days, their arms burning, their hearts empty, until they came to a strange, calm harbor surrounded by towering cliffs. This was the land of the Laestrygonians. Odysseus, his instincts now screaming with caution, moored his own ship just outside the harbor, tying it to a rock, while the other 11 ships sailed confidently into the deep, protected cove. He sent 3 scouts to investigate. The men found a well-trodden path and followed it to a clearing, where they saw a young woman of incredible size, the daughter of the Laestrygonian king. She pointed them toward her father's palace, but when they arrived, what they found was a nightmare. The queen was a mountain of a woman, as tall as a cliff, and her sight filled them with horror. She immediately screamed for her husband, King Antiphates. The king appeared, and without a word, he snatched up one of the scouts, tore him apart like a piece of bread, and began to eat him raw. The other 2 men fled for their lives, screaming in terror. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Laestrygonians, a race of man-eating giants, swarmed from the cliffs. They didn't use normal weapons. They ripped massive boulders from the cliff tops and hurled them down into the harbor. The boulders crashed through the ships, splintering hulls and snapping masts like twigs. The harbor, once a calm sanctuary, became a chaotic mess of shattered wood and drowning men. And as the sailors struggled in the water, the giants waded in, spearing them like fish, and carrying them off to their feast. It was a full-blown horror movie. From his vantage point outside the harbor, Odysseus watched, helpless, as his entire fleet, 11 ships, hundreds of his friends and countrymen, was annihilated in a matter of minutes. There was nothing he could do. He screamed for the men on his own ship to row for their lives. He took his sword and slashed the mooring ropes, and they dug their oars into the water, escaping the bloodbath by mere seconds. One ship, out of the 12 that had sailed proudly from Troy, only one remained. Odysseus had lost everything. His treasure, his fleet, and almost all of his men. The journey was no longer an adventure. It was a desperate, grim struggle for survival. Heartbroken and haunted, they sailed on, and eventually came to the island of It seemed peaceful, covered in dense forest. Odysseus saw a plume of smoke rising from the center of the island and, despite the trauma they had just endured, knew they needed to investigate. They were exhausted, starving, and out of options. He divided his remaining men into 2 groups. He would stay with one group at the ship, while his trusted kinsman, Eurylochus, would lead the other to the source of the smoke. Eurylochus and his men walked through the eerie woods until they came to a clearing. In the middle stood a grand house made of polished stone. But what was truly strange were the animals roaming the grounds. Lions and wolves, powerful predators, but they didn't attack. Instead, they padded up to the men, whining and rubbing against them like tame house pets, their eyes filled with a strange human-like sadness. From inside the house, the men could hear a beautiful voice singing, and the rhythmic sound of a loom. It was an enchanting, irresistible sound. They called out, and a woman of breathtaking beauty emerged. This was Circe, the sorceress, a goddess with a bewitching voice and a dark power. She invited them in, and all of them, charmed by her beauty and desperate for comfort, eagerly followed. All except for Eurylochus. His instincts told him this was a trap. He stayed behind, hiding in the shadows. Circe laid out a magnificent feast for the men. She gave them a special brew of wine, cheese, and honey, but she mixed into it a wicked potion. The men, starved and unsuspecting, drank it all down. The moment they finished, Circe struck each man with her wand, and they began to change. Their bodies twisted and shrank. Bristles sprouted from their skin. Their noses elongated into snouts. In seconds, Odysseus's brave warriors had been transformed into pigs. They still had their human minds, they were aware and terrified, but they were trapped in the bodies of swine. Circe then herded them into a pigsty and threw them acorns and slop. Eurylochus watched in horror. He ran back to the ship, hysterical with grief and fear, and told Odysseus what he had seen. The men were gone, turned into animals by a monstrous witch. Hearing this, Odysseus didn't hesitate. He grabbed his sword and his bow and told Eurylochus to lead him back. But Eurylochus begged him not to go, to take the ship and flee while they still could. Odysseus refused. He would not abandon his men. He set off alone to face the sorceress. On his way through the haunted woods, he was intercepted by a beautiful young man who was, in fact, the god Hermes, the messenger of Olympus. Hermes warned him that he couldn't defeat Circe with courage alone. Her magic was too powerful. The god then reached down and pulled a plant from the earth. The root was black, and the flower was as white as milk. "This is called moly," Hermes said. "It is dangerous for mortals to uproot, but not for a god. Take it. It will make you immune to Circe's potions." Hermes explained the plan. "Drink her potion, and when she tries to strike you with her wand, the moly will protect you. Then you must rush at her with your sword as if you mean to kill her. She will be terrified and will invite you to her bed. Do not refuse," Hermes warned, "but first, you must make her swear a binding oath by the gods that she will not try any more tricks, or she might unman you when you are most vulnerable." Odysseus did exactly as he was told. He arrived at Circe's palace, and she, surprised to see another visitor so soon, invited him in. She gave him the same magical potion in a golden cup. Odysseus drank it down, the moly coursing through his veins, neutralizing the poison. Circe, smiling, struck him with her wand and said, "Off to the pigsty with you to join your friends." But nothing happened. Odysseus stood there unchanged. Circe's eyes went wide with shock and fear. Before she could react, Odysseus drew his sword and lunged at her with a murderous rage in his eyes. She shrieked and fell to her knees, clutching his legs, begging for her life. She knew at once who he must be. A prophecy had long foretold that a man named Odysseus, a man of many twists and turns, would one day come to her island and resist her magic. Seeing her power broken, she immediately changed her tactics from domination to seduction. She invited him to her bed, to learn to trust one another. Odysseus, remembering Hermes' warning, refused until she swore the great, unbreakable oath of the gods not to harm him. Only then did he relent. He had passed her test. He had overcome her magic and her fear, and in doing so he won her respect and perhaps something more. He demanded she free his men, and she obliged, anointing the pigs with another potion, turning them back into men, but now younger, taller, and more handsome than before. They wept with joy as they embraced their king. Circe then invited all of them, the entire crew of the last ship, to stay with her, to rest and recover their strength. And so they did. They feasted and drank, and Odysseus shared the bed of the beautiful goddess. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The horrors of their journey began to fade, replaced by the endless comfort and pleasure of Circe's island. It was a paradise, a perfect trap not of magic but of luxury. They stayed for a full year. Finally, his men had to come to him and remind him of their true purpose. "My king," they said, "it is time to remember your own native land." The spell of comfort was broken. Odysseus knew they were right. He went to Circe and told her he had to leave. She did not try to stop him. She knew this day would come. But she told him his journey home would not be so simple. The sea route was too dangerous, too unpredictable. To find his way back to Ithaca, he first had to take a different, far more terrifying path. He had to travel to the end of the world, to the dark shores of the land of the dead, and descend into the house of Hades. This wasn't a choice. It was a command from a goddess, a grim necessity on the path home. To know the future, Odysseus had to confront the past. All of it. He and his men sailed for a day and a night, leaving the sun behind, until they reached the edge of the world, the land of the Sumerians, a people shrouded in perpetual mist and darkness. Here the sun never shines. It is the bleak frontier between the living and the dead. Following Circe's instructions to the letter, Odysseus disembarked. He walked to the spot she described, where the river of fire and the river of tears converge. There, with his bronze sword, he dug a pit in the dark earth, about a forearm's length deep and wide. Around this pit, he performed a solemn, desperate ritual for the dead. First, he poured a libation of milk and honey, then one of sweet wine, and finally one of water. Over it all he sprinkled white barley. He prayed to the lifeless shades, promising that if he made it back to Ithaca, he would sacrifice his finest heifer and heap the pyre with treasures. But for Tiresias the prophet, he promised a special offering, a magnificent black ram, the best of his flock. When the prayers were done, he took the sheep Circe had given him, a black ram and a black ewe, and holding their heads over the pit, he slit their throats. The dark blood flowed into the earth, and from the depths of Erebus, the house of darkness, they came, the souls of the dead, drawn by the scent of fresh blood. They were the ghosts of brides, of young men, of old men who had suffered much, of young girls with hearts new to sorrow, of warriors slain in battle, their armor still stained with blood. They swarmed around the pit with an unearthly cry, a sound so terrifying that pale fear seized Odysseus. He shouted at his men to flay and burn the sheep, to pray to the gods of the underworld, to Hades and his queen Persephone. But Odysseus himself stood his ground. Sword drawn, he guarded the pit of blood, a lone living man holding back a tide of ghosts. He had to wait. He couldn't let any of them drink until he had spoken with the one he came here for. Tiresias, the first soul he recognized, made his heart ache. It was Elpenor, one of his own crew. Odysseus hadn't even known he was gone. The young man, heavy with wine, had fallen asleep on the roof of Circe's palace. When he awoke to the sounds of the crew preparing to leave, he forgot where he was, stumbled, and fell to his death, snapping his neck. His body was still lying there, unburied and unmourned. Tears streamed down Odysseus's face. "Elpenor," he cried out, "how did you get here? You came on foot, faster than I did in my black ship." The ghost of the young man wept. "It was the wine and a cruel fate," he explained. "I beg you, my king, when you return to Circe's island, do not forget me. Do not leave me unburied. Build a mound for me on the shore, and plant on it the oar I pulled with my comrades." Odysseus, his voice thick with grief, swore he would. It was the first of many promises he would make in this dark place. Then another spirit approached, and this one shattered him completely. It was his mother, Anticlea. When he'd left for Troy, she had been alive and well. He never knew she had died. He stared, frozen in shock and sorrow, as she drifted near the blood. He couldn't speak to her, couldn't even let his own mother drink, not until Tiresias came. The agony of that moment was a new kind of wound, deeper than any Trojan spear. Finally, the soul he was waiting for appeared. Tiresias of Thebes, the blind prophet, holding a golden scepter. He knew Odysseus at once. "Son of Laertes," the shade spoke, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Why have you left the light of the sun to see this joyless place? Step back from the pit. Let me drink the blood, and I will tell you the truth." Odysseus sheathed his sword and stepped back. The prophet drank deeply from the dark pool, and then he spoke the future. His words were a map and a warning. "You seek a sweet homecoming," Tiresias said, "but a god will make it bitter. Poseidon, the earthshaker, is enraged that you blinded his son, the Cyclops. He will not forget. But you can still reach home," the prophet continued. "If you and your men can control your desires, your path will take you to the island of Thrinacia. There you will find the cattle and sheep of Helios, the sun god. Do not touch them. Do not harm a single one. If you leave them alone and think only of your return, you may yet reach Ithaca, though not without suffering. But if you harm them, I see destruction, for your ship and for your men. And even if you yourself escape, you will return home late in a wretched state, having lost all your comrades in a foreign ship. And you will find a world of pain in your own house. Arrogant men devouring your livelihood, courting your wife." The prophecy was a dagger. Not only was the journey home fraught with peril, but home itself was no longer a safe harbor. It was a battlefield. Tiresias wasn't finished. He told Odysseus that he would kill these suitors by stealth or by sword. But even then, his journey would not be over. "You must take up a well-made oar," the prophet commanded. and walk inland. Walk until you find a people who know nothing of the sea, who do not eat their food with salt, who have never seen a crimson-prowed ship. You will know you are there when another traveler mistakes your oar for a winnowing fan, a tool for separating wheat from chaff. At that spot, Tiresias concluded, you must plant your oar in the earth and make a perfect sacrifice to Lord Poseidon. Then you may return home, and death will come for you from the sea, a gentle death and a comfortable old age, with your people prosperous around you. This is the truth. The prophecy was complete. A brutal, difficult path, but a path nonetheless. After Tiresias faded back into the gloom, Odysseus finally allowed his mother to approach the blood. She drank, and recognition dawned in her spectral eyes. Her first words were a torrent of questions. My child, how did you come here alive to this dark land? How is your wife, your son, your father? Odysseus told her everything he could. He then asked how she had died. Her answer was a testament to the pain of his absence. It wasn't sickness, she said, her voice filled with a ghostly sorrow. It was my longing for you, Odysseus. My grief for you, my constant worry, that stole the sweet life from my body. He yearned to hold her, to give her some comfort. 3 times he lunged forward to embrace her spirit, and 3 times she slipped through his arms like a shadow or a dream. The pain was unbearable. Mother, he cried, why do you not stay for me to hold? So that even in the house of Hades, we might find some cold comfort in our grief. This is the way of all mortals when they die, she explained gently. The fire consumes our flesh and bone, and the soul flits away like a dream. But now you must hurry back to the light. Remember all you have seen so you can tell your wife. After his mother departed, a procession of other famous souls appeared. He spoke with Agamemnon, the king who led the Greeks at Troy. Agamemnon's ghost told a bitter, horrifying story of his own homecoming. He wasn't shipwrecked, he wasn't killed in battle. He was murdered in his own dining hall, butchered like an ox at the trough, by his treacherous wife Clytemnestra and her lover. His story was a chilling warning for Odysseus. Trust no one, Agamemnon hissed. Not even your own wife. Test the ground before you plant your feet. Then came the spirit of Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived. Odysseus tried to praise him, saying, you were honored like a god when you were alive, and now you are a mighty king among the dead. Surely death has no sting for you. Achilles' reply was stark, and it has echoed through the centuries. Do not speak to me of death's glories, Odysseus, the great warrior said. I would rather be a slave, a hired hand for a poor landless farmer on earth, than be the king of all these perished souls. Life, any kind of life, was infinitely more precious than a glorious death. He saw Ajax, the hulking warrior who had killed himself in shame after losing the contest for Achilles' armor to Odysseus. Odysseus tried to reconcile, to speak to him, but Ajax's ghost simply turned away, silent, carrying his grudge even into eternity. The ghosts kept coming, a flood of memories and sorrows. But then the mood shifted. The dead began to press in, their whispers turning into a terrifying moan. Odysseus felt a primal fear grip him. He imagined Persephone might send forth the ultimate horror, the head of the Gorgon Medusa, whose gaze turned men to stone. That was enough. Terror overrode his curiosity. He turned and ran, shouting for his men to get back on the ship, to cast off the lines. They scrambled aboard, their faces as pale as his, and began to row with all their might. They rowed away from the land of perpetual night, away from the crying shades, back toward the ocean and the distant, precious light of the sun, with a prophet's grim warning echoing in their captain's mind. That grim warning was a poisoned seed planted in his soul, a prophecy of ruin, delivered by a ghost in a land of ghosts. Every pull of the oar was a stroke away from the land of the dead, but it was also a stroke toward the future Tiresias had laid out for him, a path lined with monsters, temptation, and death. When they finally beached their ship, it wasn't on some unknown, hostile shore. It was back on the island of the sorceress Circe. She was waiting for them. The men, seeing her and her handmaidens bringing bread, meat, and wine, felt a wave of relief. They had survived the land of the dead. But Odysseus knew this was no social call. Circe had let him go to the underworld. Now she would tell him how to survive the path it had revealed. That night, as his exhausted crew slept, Circe sat with Odysseus and laid out the horrors to come, not as a vague prophecy, but as a tactical briefing from hell. She spoke first of the Sirens, not beautiful mermaids, but monstrous bird-like creatures with the heads of women, whose song was an instrument of pure, irresistible death. Their voices, she said, were so beautiful, so full of a promise of ultimate knowledge and peace, that any sailor who heard them would be compelled to steer his ship directly onto the rocks, where he would be torn apart and his bones would join the piles of other victims rotting on their island shore. The only way to pass them, she explained, was for his crew to plug their ears with beeswax, rendering them deaf to the fatal melody. But for Odysseus, the man who needed to know everything, she offered a different path. If you wish to hear it, she said, have your men bind you to the mast of the ship, tie you hand and foot so tightly that you cannot move, and command them under penalty of death, that no matter how much you beg or scream, or command them to release you, they are to only bind you tighter. Then she described the next trial. A choice between two paths, both of them fatal. On one side of a narrow strait was a monster named Charybdis. Charybdis wasn't a creature you could fight. It was a living whirlpool, a cataclysm of nature. 3 times a day she would suck down the ocean itself, swallowing entire ships whole, leaving not so much as a splinter of wood behind. To sail near Charybdis was to risk total, absolute annihilation. On the other side of the strait, clinging to the cliffs, was the second monster, Scylla. Scylla, Circe explained, was once a beautiful nymph, but now she was a creature of pure nightmare. She had 12 dangling, deformed feet and 6 long serpentine necks, and on the end of each neck was a gruesome head filled with 3 rows of razor-sharp teeth. She would hide in her cave, and as a ship passed, her 6 heads would strike like lightning, plucking 6 men from the deck and devouring them alive as they screamed for help. Odysseus, ever the warrior, asked the obvious question. Can't I fight her? Can't I arm myself, stand on the prow, and defend my men from Scylla? Circe's reply was chilling. You stubborn man, she said, always looking for a fight. Scylla is not mortal. She is a mortal death. You cannot fight her. You cannot beat her. The only strategy is to flee. Then she delivered the brutal calculus of leadership. It is better by far to lose 6 men and mourn them, than to lose your entire crew and your ship. He was being told to choose a path, knowing that men would die. He was being told to sacrifice 6 of his companions to save the rest. Finally, she repeated the prophet's warning about the island of Thrinacia, the island of the sun god, Helios. She described his sacred cattle, perfect and immortal, and warned him with the gravest severity. Do not touch them. Do not even think of harming a single one. If you and your men can leave them be, you may yet see Ithaca. But if you harm them, she said, I foretell destruction for your ship and for your crew. The next morning, with the sun rising, Odysseus and his men set sail once more. As they approached the island of the Sirens, he did exactly as Circe had instructed. He took a block of beeswax, softened it in his hands, and went to each of his men, carefully pressing the wax deep into their ears until they could hear nothing but the muffled thump of their own blood. Then, he had them bind him to the mast. He gave them the order, tie me tight, and if I command you to release me, tie me tighter still. As the ship sailed on, a strange quiet fell, and then it began. The song of the Sirens drifted across the water. It was more beautiful than anything he had ever heard. It wasn't just a melody, it was a promise. They sang of his glory at Troy, of the battles he had won, the praise he had earned. They sang of a world without pain, without struggle. They sang, Come to us, glorious Odysseus, pride of the Achaeans. We know everything. We know all the suffering you have endured, and we know all that is to come. Come here, and we will give you rest and knowledge. It was a poison tailored specifically for him. The song promised to unburden him of his trauma, while feeding his ego and his insatiable curiosity. He was transfixed. He felt an overwhelming, desperate need to go to them. He began to struggle against the ropes, his eyes wild. He screamed at his men, ordering them, begging them to untie him, to turn the ship. But they, deaf to the song and obedient to his original command, only saw their captain's madness. 2 of his strongest men, Perimedes and Eurylochus, got up and, as instructed, pulled the ropes even tighter, the coarse fibers cutting into his skin until he was completely immobilized, able to do nothing but watch as they rode past the island of bones, past the promise of fatal knowledge, until the song finally faded into the wind. When they were safely away, his men took the wax from their ears and unbound him. He stood there, trembling, the phantom melody still echoing in his head, but there was no time for relief. Ahead, the sea began to churn. They could hear a terrifying, thunderous roar. They were approaching the strait. On one side, they saw the ocean itself seeming to boil and collapse inward, a horrifying vortex of spray and foam, Charybdis. The men were paralyzed with fear, dropping their oars. Odysseus knew he had to act. He strode through the ship, clapping men on the back, reminding them of the Cyclops, of all the other dangers they had faced and overcome. He shouted orders, telling them to row hard and fast, to hug the cliffside. He was deliberately steering them away from the total destruction of Charybdis, and directly toward the alternative. He was steering them toward Scylla. He didn't tell them what was coming. How could he? How could he look them in the eye and say, "6 of you are about to die, and I'm choosing for it to happen"? He armed himself anyway, despite Circe's warning, holding 2 long spears, and stood on the foredeck, scanning the cliffs for any sign of the monster. But as he stared, watching for Scylla, he was distracted by the terrifying spectacle of Charybdis on the other side. The water was being vomited back up in a geyser of chaos, and in that moment of distraction it happened. There was no warning, just a blur of motion from above. 6 long, ghastly necks shot down from the cliff face with unnatural speed. 6 of his best men were snatched from the deck. One moment they were rowing, the next they were airborne, screaming and flailing in the grip of the monster's jaws. Odysseus saw it all. He saw them being lifted high into the air toward the cave. He heard them screaming his name, one last, desperate cry for the captain who had led them here. It was, he would later say, the most pitiful thing his eyes had ever seen. He watched, helpless, as Scylla dragged his men into her dark lair to be devoured. The sounds of their screams echoed off the cliffs and then fell silent. And then they were through. The ship, now 6 men lighter, glided into calmer waters. The crew was in shock, weeping not just for their lost friends, but at the sheer horror of what they had just witnessed. Odysseus felt a grief so profound it was like a physical weight, a cold stone in his gut. He had made the choice. He had sacrificed 6 to save the rest. But the faces of those men, their final desperate cries, would haunt him forever. Exhausted, traumatized, and broken, they looked ahead, and there it was, a beautiful green island bathed in an eerie golden light. On the shore they could see them, magnificent herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, grazing peacefully. It was Thrinacia, the island of the sun god, the one place in all the world they had been so desperately warned to avoid. Odysseus felt a cold dread snake up his spine. He remembered the words of Tiresias in the underworld, the warning from the sorceress Circe, "Do not touch the sacred cattle of Helios, the sun god." He turned to his men, his voice raw with urgency. "We cannot land here. We must row on past this island no matter how tired we are. This is the one place we were forbidden to go." But his crew was at its breaking point. They had just survived the Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis. Their arms ached, their spirits were shattered, and the sight of a peaceful island with fresh water and green pastures was more tempting than any siren's song. It was his second-in-command, Eurylochus, who spoke for them all, his voice thick with resentment and exhaustion. "Are you made of iron, Odysseus?" he spat. "Your men are dead on their feet. You expect us to row all night through a black sea blindly, when a safe harbor is right here. Are you so eager to see more of us die? I say we land. We make supper, we sleep on solid ground, and we set out again in the morning. A man can't fight fate on an empty stomach." A roar of approval went up from the crew. It was a mutiny, plain and simple. Odysseus saw the look in their eyes. They were done listening. He was outvoted, his authority crumbling against the sheer force of their exhaustion. He knew he had only one play left. He could not stop them from landing, but he could try to bind them with the one thing they still feared, the wrath of the gods. "Fine," Odysseus relented, his face grim. "We will land. But you will all swear a solemn oath. Swear it on the river Styx, the most sacred vow there is. Swear that not a single man will touch the cattle or the sheep on this island. They belong to a terrible god. We will eat the food Circe gave us and nothing else. Swear it." One by one, they raised their hands and swore the oath. They were desperate for rest, and an oath seemed a small price to pay. They landed the ship, made their supper from the last of their provisions, and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, the lowing of the sacred cattle a gentle sound in the night. But the gods were not finished with them. That night a storm blew in. Not a normal storm but a divine, relentless gale. For an entire month, the south wind blew without ceasing, trapping them on the island. Their ship was beached, the sea a churning white-capped fury. Their food ran out. The bread and wine given by Circe were gone. Starvation began to set in, a gnawing, hollow ache in their bellies. They became desperate. They tried fishing, but their catches were meager, barely enough to keep them alive. They hunted birds, anything that moved. But it wasn't enough. Day by day they grew weaker, their faces gaunt, their eyes shadowed with hunger. The magnificent, fat, healthy cattle of the sun god grazed peacefully just feet away. A constant, agonizing temptation. They could hear them, smell them. It was torture. Seeing his men wasting away, Odysseus walked inland to a secluded spot to pray. He begged the gods on Olympus to show him a way out, to end the storm, to save his crew. But his prayers went unanswered. Instead, the gods poured a deep, heavy sleep over him, and he collapsed unconscious into the grass. It was the moment Eurylochus had been waiting for. With Odysseus gone, he gathered the starving crew around him. His eyes burned with a feverish intensity. "Listen to me," he began, his voice a low, persuasive hiss. "You've all faced death with Odysseus. But of all the ways a man can die, the slowest, most pathetic death is by starvation. Are we to wither away here, chewing on twigs, when a feast is right in front of us?" He gestured to the cattle. "Yes, they belong to a god. And yes, we swore an oath. But what is that oath compared to this slow agony? I say we drive off the best of the herd. We sacrifice them to the gods to appease them. We can promise Helios that if we ever make it back to Ithaca, we will build him the most magnificent temple, fill it with treasures to make up for this. It's a fair trade, isn't it? And even if he gets angry, even if he smashes our ship and we all drown, isn't a quick death in the waves better than this? Wasting away bone by bone on this cursed beach." His logic was twisted, but to starving men it sounded like salvation. It was the permission they craved. A roar of approval went up. The oath was forgotten. Madness took them. They rounded up the finest, fattest cattle of the sun god. But their sacrilege didn't end there. They had no barley to sprinkle for the sacrifice, so they used oak leaves. They had no wine for the libations, so they used water from a stream. It was a grotesque mockery of a sacred ritual. They slaughtered the animals, butchered them, and soon, the forbidden aroma of roasting meat filled the air. It was this smell that woke Odysseus. He bolted upright, the scent of sacrilege hitting him like a physical blow. He knew instantly what had happened. He sprinted back to the beach, his heart pounding with dread, and the sight that met him made him cry out in despair. His men, his once loyal crew, were feasting, their faces slick with grease, their eyes wild with a gluttonous joy. They had doomed themselves. They had doomed them all. And then the omens began. A horror straight from a nightmare. The flayed hides of the slaughtered cattle began to crawl and slither along the ground on their own. The meat on the spits, both raw and cooked, began to moan and bellow, as if the cows were still alive. The men saw it. They heard it. But their hunger was so great, so all-consuming, that they didn't stop. They kept eating. But their crime had not gone unnoticed. Far away, the nymph Lampetie, a daughter of Helios who tended his flocks, shot up to the heavens. She found her father and told him everything. Helios, the sun god, exploded in a blaze of fury. He strode into the assembly of the gods on Mount Olympus, his face a mask of incandescent rage. "Father Zeus," he roared, his voice shaking the heavens, "and all you other blessed gods, you must punish the men of Odysseus. They have slaughtered my cattle, my pride and joy, the creatures I love to watch each day as I rose and set in the sky. If you do not deliver justice, a justice that fits this crime, then I swear by the cosmos itself, I will take my son, and I will drive it down into the house of Hades. I will let it shine among the dead, and the world of the living will be plunged into eternal frozen night." It was the ultimate threat. Cosmic blackmail. The entire order of the universe was at stake. Zeus, the king of the gods, had no choice. His face was grim, his voice like rolling thunder. "Calm yourself, Helios. I will handle this." I will strike their ship with a single white-hot thunderbolt and shatter it to pieces in the middle of the wine-dark sea." Back on the island, the men knew nothing of this celestial judgment. For 6 more days they feasted on the sacred meat, gorging themselves. On the 7th day the impossible happened. The storm finally broke. The wind died down, the sun came out, and the sea became as smooth as glass. The crew cheered. They saw it as a sign. The gods had accepted their pathetic sacrifice. They were forgiven. Eagerly, they launched their ship, hoisted the sail, and pulled away from the island of Thrinacia, their bellies full of beef, their hearts full of a foolish, fatal hope. They sailed on, the island shrinking behind them. But once they were alone on the open sea, with no land in sight, the sky suddenly turned a dark, bruised purple. A new storm, a storm of pure divine vengeance, screamed out of the west. The wind hit the mast with such force it snapped in two, crashing down and killing the helmsman instantly. The ship was plunged into a terrifying darkness, lit only by flashes of lightning. Odysseus clung to the deck, the roar of the wind and waves deafening. And then he saw it. A bolt of lightning, brighter than 1,000 suns, gathered directly above them. Zeus was making good on his promise. It screamed down from the heavens and struck the ship dead center. The world exploded in a cataclysm of thunder and fire. The ship disintegrated, the smell of sulfur and splintered wood filling the air. All of his men, every last one, were thrown into the churning black water, their cries swallowed by the storm as they sank beneath the waves, never to be seen again. Odysseus alone, the last man, clinging to the splintered keel and mast of his ship, the only 2 pieces of timber that hadn't been blasted to smithereens by Zeus's lightning. He lashed them together with a strip of leather, creating a crude makeshift raft. And for 9 days he drifted. 9 days under a relentless sun, his skin cracking, his throat raw with thirst. 9 nights under a cold, indifferent blanket of stars, the ghosts of his crewmates whispering in the crash of every wave. This wasn't the cunning general of Troy. This wasn't the king of Ithaca. This was just a man stripped of everything, a speck of life in an infinite hostile sea waiting for the end. What goes through a mind in that kind of isolation? The human spirit is a stubborn thing, but even it has its limits. He must have relived every mistake, every warning he ignored, the bag of winds, the cattle of the sun. He had been so close, and now he was further from home than ever before. The salt water leached the life from him, the sun baked his sanity, and the vast, crushing emptiness of the ocean threatened to swallow his hope whole. Then on the 10th day, when his strength was gone and his consciousness was fading, the currents of the sea delivered him. He washed ashore on an island, Ogygia, and this was no barren rock. It was a paradise, a place so beautiful it seemed unreal. A lush forest of alder and black poplar and cypress trees hummed with the songs of unseen birds. Soft meadows were carpeted with violets and wild parsley, for springs fed crystal-clear streams that crisscrossed the landscape. And at the heart of it all was a deep, vaulted cave, its entrance draped in a thick curtain of grapevines heavy with fruit. This was the home of Calypso, the nymph with the lovely braids, a goddess, daughter of the Titan Atlas. She found the half-drowned man on her shore, a broken thing of salt and sun and sorrow. She carried him to her cave, nursed him back to health, fed him nectar and ambrosia, the food of the gods themselves. She clothed him in immortal robes and offered him her love. And she offered him something more. Something no monster, no king, no sorceress had ever offered him before. Immortality. She looked at this mortal man, this masterpiece of suffering and resilience, and she fell deeply in love. She promised him that if he stayed with her, he would never grow old, never get sick, never die. He would live forever with her in this perfect, timeless paradise. Think about that offer. Really think about it. After 20 years of war and wandering, after watching every single one of your friends die horribly, after facing cannibals, monsters, and the wrath of the gods, after starving and drowning and fighting for every single breath, someone offers you an escape, an end to all pain, an eternity of comfort, beauty, and love with the goddess. No more struggle, no more loss, just peace, forever. How could anyone refuse that? But Odysseus did, every single day. He would take the divine food Calypso gave him, and then he would walk down to the rocky shore, sit, and stare out at the empty horizon, the unvintaged sea, as Homer calls it, and he would weep. His body was in paradise, but his mind, his soul, was in torment. He wept for his wife, Penelope, for his son Telemachus, who was just a baby when he left. He wept for his rocky and perfect island kingdom of Ithaca. He wept for his own mortality, because what Calypso didn't understand, what she couldn't understand, is that a life without struggle is a life without meaning. An eternity without the people you love is not a gift. It's the cruelest prison imaginable. He didn't want to be an immortal god living in a cage, no matter how gilded. He wanted to be a mortal man, a husband, a father, and a king, living his one precious finite life in the place he called home. He was a prisoner of comfort, held captive by a love he could not return. And this went on for 7 years. 7 years. Let that sink in. Nearly 3,000 days of the same routine, waking in a goddess's bed, eating divine food, and then walking to the shore to cry his heart out for a home he was beginning to believe he would never see again. This was a new kind of hell. Not the visceral tooth and claw horror of the Cyclops' cave, but a slow, quiet psychological erosion. Calypso was trying to love him into forgetting who he was. She was trying to smother his identity with comfort and luxury. And with every passing year, the memory of Penelope's face, the sound of his son's voice, the very feeling of being Odysseus, king of Ithaca, faded just a little bit more. But up on Mount Olympus, someone had not forgotten him. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, his divine protector, saw his suffering. She saw her favorite mortal wasting away, his spirit being crushed. She decided enough was enough. She strode into the great hall of the gods and stood before her father, the mighty Zeus. She reminded him of Odysseus's piety, the sacrifices he'd made, his cleverness, his courage. She painted a vivid picture of his suffering, trapped on that island, his heart breaking day after day. How could the king of the gods, the arbiter of justice, allow such a good man to suffer this fate? Zeus, moved by his daughter's plea and perhaps feeling a bit guilty for that lightning bolt he threw, finally relented. It was time. Odysseus's journey had not yet ended. He turned to his son, Hermes, the messenger god with the winged sandals. His orders were simple and direct. Fly to Ogygia. Tell Calypso that the will of the gods is absolute. She is to release Odysseus and help him on his way. Hermes shot down from the heavens like a falling star, skimming over the waves until he reached the hidden isle. He landed silently and walked toward the cave, breathing in the divine perfume of burning cedar and thyme. He found Calypso inside, weaving at her loom with a golden shuttle, her beautiful voice filling the cavern with song. She knew him instantly and, as is the custom of the gods, offered him hospitality. But Hermes was on a mission. He delivered Zeus's decree. Calypso's reaction was not submission. It was rage, a torrent of divine fury. You gods are the most jealous and cruel beings in the cosmos, she seethed. You can't stand to see a goddess sleep with a mortal man, even when she loves him. You have your affairs, you father children with any mortal woman who catches your eye, and no one says a word. But when I rescue a good man from the sea, when I love him and offer him eternal life, you get together and decide to rip him away from me. It's rank hypocrisy. And you know what? She had a point. The Greek gods were notoriously petty and unfair. But her argument, however valid, was useless against the will of Zeus. She knew she could not defy him. With a heavy heart, she went to find Odysseus at his usual spot on the beach. He was there, of course, his eyes red from weeping, letting the sweet days of his life drain away. She went to him and, putting a gentle spin on the situation, told him that she had decided to let him go, that she pitied him and would help him build a raft to sail home. Odysseus's first reaction wasn't joy. It was suspicion. After 20 years of tricks and traps, he had learned to trust no one, especially not a divine being. He looked her in the eye and said, "This is another trap, isn't it? You're going to put me on a raft and then have some sea monster finish me off." He refused to even touch a piece of wood until she swore the great, unbreakable oath of the gods on the river Styx that she would do him no harm. Calypso, heartbroken but resigned, swore the oath. For the next 4 days, Odysseus was a man reborn. He was no longer the weeping prisoner. He was the builder, the craftsman, the leader. Calypso gave him a great bronze axe, and he went to work. He felled 20 trees, trimmed them, planed them smooth, and expertly joined them together. He built a deck, raised a mast, and fitted it with a rudder. He was creating the vessel of his own salvation, pouring all his remaining hope and longing into its construction. On the 5th day the raft was ready. Calypso gave him provisions, sacks of grain, skins of water and wine, and dried meats. She conjured a warm, gentle wind to blow him east toward home. As he prepared to leave, she asked him one last time, "Are you sure? Is your mortal wife really more beautiful than I am? Can she offer you more than eternal youth?" And Odysseus, with his trademark diplomacy and wisdom, answered her, "My queen, you are a goddess. You are far more beautiful. But she is my wife and my heart longs for home. I am a man born for hardship, and if another god tries to wreck me on the sea, I will endure it. I have suffered so much already. I can suffer more." And with that, he pushed his raft into the sea, caught the wind in his sail, and left the island of Ogygia behind. For 17 days he sailed, navigating by the stars as Calypso had instructed, the constellations his only guide. The land was finally in sight, the hazy shores of the Phaeacians. He was close, so close, he could almost feel the solid ground of a friendly kingdom beneath his feet. But someone else saw him. Someone who had been nursing a grudge for a very long time. From his mountain top, Poseidon, the god of the sea, the earthshaker, spotted the tiny raft on his waters. He saw the man who had blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, and his face darkened with a terrible divine rage. He gripped his trident, and the sky began to turn black. He raised his trident and thrust it deep into the wine-dark sea, stirring the waters into a frenzy. He gathered the clouds from every corner of the sky and unleashed the winds. The east wind, the south wind, the west wind, the north wind. All four screamed across the waves, colliding in a maelstrom of chaos. A wave, the size of a mountain, rose up and crashed down on Odysseus's flimsy raft. The mast snapped like a toothpick, tearing the sail with it and flinging Odysseus deep into the churning water. He was trapped beneath the waves, the weight of his waterlogged clothes dragging him down, the sheer force of the storm holding him under. His lungs burned. For a moment he thought this was it. This was the ignoble end the fates had planned for him. A death at sea, his body lost forever. No glory, no homecoming. But his will, that indomitable part of him that had survived Troy, that had outsmarted a Cyclops, fought back. He kicked for the surface, breaking through the foam, gasping for air. He saw the wreckage of his raft nearby and, with a surge of adrenaline, swam for it, clinging to the splintered timbers as if they were life itself. The winds tore at him, tossing him back and forth like a piece of driftwood. He was completely at the mercy of Poseidon's rage. And just as the last of his hope began to fade, a figure emerged from the waves. It was the goddess Ino, once a mortal queen, now a divine nereid of the sea. She pitied the hero. She landed on his raft like a seabird and spoke to him. She told him to abandon the raft, to strip off his heavy clothes, and to swim for the distant shore of the Phaeacians. And to help him, she offered him her veil, an immortal, shimmering scarf. "Tie this around your waist," she said, "and it will protect you. No harm will come to you. But once you reach the shore, you must throw it back into the sea without looking." And then she was gone, diving back into the waves. Odysseus was left alone, clutching the divine veil, his mind racing. Could he trust her? Was this another trick? One of the gods, perhaps even Poseidon himself, luring him to his death? He was a man who had learned caution through bitter experience. He thought of Calypso, of Circe. Deception was the currency of the gods. Clinging to the wreckage at least felt like a tangible chance. Leaving it meant putting his faith entirely in a goddess he'd never met. He hesitated. He decided to hold on to the raft for as long as it held together. But Poseidon was watching. The god saw the intervention, saw the hero's hesitation, and decided to end it. He summoned an even greater wave, a liquid wall that blotted out the sky. It fell upon Odysseus with the force of 1,000 hammers, shattering the raft into kindling and scattering the timbers across the ocean. The choice was made for him. Odysseus snatched the veil, tied it around his naked waist, and plunged into the sea. He began to swim. For 2 days and 2 nights he was adrift. The divine scarf kept him from drowning, but it didn't stop the exhaustion, the cold that seeped into his bones, or the despair that gnawed at his mind. The salt water corroded his skin. His muscles screamed in protest. He was a lone man, a tiny speck of life in an endless, violent ocean, fighting against the wrath of a god. On the dawn of the third day, the winds finally died down. The sea grew calm. As he crested a large swell, he saw it. Land. A dark, hazy line on the horizon. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. He swam with renewed purpose, every last ounce of his energy focused on that shoreline. But as he drew closer, his hope turned to horror. There was no beach, no gentle harbor, only jagged cliffs and sharp black rocks, where the surf crashed with a deafening roar. The waves would pick him up and smash him against those rocks like a child's toy. He was so close, yet death was still reaching for him. He saw a small inlet, a potential landing spot, and swam for it, but a powerful wave caught him, scraping him across a razor-sharp reef, tearing the skin from his hands and arms. It sucked him back out to sea, and he nearly drowned again. He was bleeding, exhausted, his body a canvas of pain. He knew he couldn't survive another impact like that. This, he thought, was the cruelest trick of all. To show him land only to have it be the instrument of his death. It was then that Athena, his protector, intervened. She didn't appear in a flash of light or send an eagle. Instead, she planted a thought in his weary mind, a spark of his own famous cunning. Look for a river. A river's mouth would break the coastline, its outflowing current smoothing the violent surf. He scanned the shore, his eyes stinging with salt, and there it was, a place where the water ran calm, sheltered by reeds. He swam towards it, his movements slow, his limbs heavy as lead. As he reached the mouth of the river, he did something that showed the core of his character. He didn't just crawl ashore. He prayed. He prayed to the god of the river, a nameless deity he did not know. He spoke aloud, his voice hoarse and broken. "Hear me, Lord, whoever you are. I come to you as a supplicant, fleeing the wrath of Poseidon. Pity a man who has suffered so much." And the river god heard him. The current slowed, the water grew still, and a path opened for him. Odysseus swam into the calm water of the river and finally, felt his knees touch soft earth. He crawled onto the bank, the divine veil falling from his waist. He remembered Ino's command. Without looking back, he threw the shimmering scarf into the river, and a wave carried it back out to the deep. Then he collapsed. He kissed the life-giving earth, the first solid ground he had stood on in nearly 3 weeks. He was naked, his body bruised and swollen, caked in brine and blood. He was a wreck of a man, stripped of his ship, his crew, and his dignity. He found a small thicket where 2 olive trees, one wild, one cultivated, had grown together, their branches so thick that even the wettest wind could not penetrate them. It was a perfect, natural shelter. He scraped together a bed of fallen leaves and burrowed into them, covering himself for warmth. He lay there, shivering, on the brink of death from exposure and exhaustion, but he was alive. He had survived the sea. He had defied the earthshaker himself. As sleep, deep and profound, finally overtook him, he was unaware that he had landed on Scylla, the island of the Phaeacians, a seafaring people beloved by the gods. He was no longer lost at sea. He was now lost in a new land with no idea who lived there, or whether they were savage or civilized. He had survived the fury of nature and the rage of a god, but his greatest test was yet to come, navigating the world of men. He awoke to the sound of laughter, not the cruel cackling of monsters or the hollow echoes of the underworld, but the light, carefree sound of young women. Caked in brine, covered in leaves, with nothing but a leafy branch for modesty, Odysseus was a ghost of a man. He was a king reduced to a wild creature, crawling out of the undergrowth. And before him, by a river, was a princess and her handmaidens. This was Nausicaa, daughter of the king of this land, a place called Scylla. And here was his first test in this new world of men. He couldn't charge forward. He'd terrify them. He couldn't stay hidden. He'd die of exposure. He had to use the one weapon that hadn't been washed away by the sea: his mind, his words. From a distance he began to speak, his voice raspy from thirst and disuse. He didn't beg. He didn't command. He flattered. He compared the princess to a goddess, to Artemis herself. He crafted his words with the precision of a master carpenter, building a bridge of trust between the wild man in the bushes and the royalty before him. He explained his plight not as a victim demanding pity, but as an unfortunate traveler seeking the kindness that civilization is built upon. It worked. Nausicaa, far from being frightened, was impressed. She saw past the grime and the desperation and saw the nobility within. Here was a man of intelligence and bearing. She ordered her maids to give him food, drink, and clothes, and to let him bathe in the river. And as the salt and dirt washed away, the man who emerged was no longer a beast, but a hero. Athena, his divine protector, cast a glamour over him, making him taller, more handsome, his hair flowing like hyacinth flowers. The transformation was so complete. Nausicaa looked at him and wished aloud that she could find a husband just like him. She knew she couldn't be seen walking into the city with a strange godlike man. Tongues would wag. So she gave him careful instructions. Wait until they had gone, then make his way to the palace of her father, King Alcinous. But she stressed, do not appeal to the king. Go straight to my mother, Queen Arete. If you win her favor, your passage home is guaranteed. Odysseus did as he was told. Cloaked in a mist by Athena to hide him from view, he walked through the astonishing city of the Phaeacians. This was a place unlike any he had ever seen. It was a kind of paradise. The people here weren't warriors, they were master sailors. Their ships were almost magical, guided by thought, able to cross the sea in an instant without need for a pilot. Their palace was a wonder of bronze walls, silver and gold doors, and orchards that bore fruit year-round. It was a world of perfect peace and prosperity, a stark, painful reminder of the orderly kingdom he had lost. He entered the great hall, the mist dissolving around him. He walked past the feasting lords, past King Alcinous on his throne, and did exactly as Nausicaa had instructed. He fell to his knees, not before the king, but before the queen. He wrapped his arms around her knees in the ancient gesture of a desperate supplicant and made his plea. He told her of his suffering, of his years lost at sea, and begged for a ship to carry him home. A stunned silence fell over the hall. Who was this stranger who appeared from nowhere and showed such deference to the queen? Queen Arete was the first to speak. She recognized the clothes he was wearing as one she had woven herself for her daughter. She questioned him, and Odysseus, ever the tactician, told them a carefully edited version of his story. He spoke of his 7 years trapped on Calypso's island and his shipwreck, but he cleverly left out his name, wanting to gauge their character first. King Alcinous, a good and honorable man, immediately raised Odysseus from the floor, sat him in a place of honor, and promised him a feast, games, and safe passage home on the morrow. The Phaeacians were famous for their hospitality, and they would not fail this stranger. The next day was one of celebration. They held athletic games in Odysseus's honor. The young Phaeacian men, proud of their prowess, challenged him. At first, Odysseus declined, saying he was too broken by suffering to compete. But when one of them mocked him, calling him a soft merchant, the old fire of the warrior king ignited. Odysseus stood up, grabbed a discus far heavier than any the others had used, and with a single mighty throw, sent it flying further than any of their marks. The Phaeacians fell silent, awestruck. They knew then they were in the presence of no ordinary man. That evening at the grand feast, the final act of this drama unfolded. The king called for his court bard, a blind man named Demodocus, to sing for them. And the bard, inspired by the muses, began to sing of the Trojan War. He sang of the quarrel between Achilles and Odysseus. He sang of the Trojan horse, the master stratagem devised by the brilliant Odysseus himself. And as he listened to the stories of his own glory, his own pain, his own lost friends, sung as entertainment for strangers, Odysseus could not bear it. He pulled his cloak over his head to hide his face and began to weep. He wasn't just crying for his fallen comrades. He was crying for the man he used to be, the hero of the songs, a man so far removed from the broken castaway sitting at this table. Only King Alcinous noticed his guest's silent grief. He stopped the song and turned to Odysseus. The time for games and secrets was over. Tell me, the king said gently, who are you? What is your name? And what is the story of your suffering that makes you weep so to hear the tales of Troy? And so, for the first time in 10 years, he told them everything. He dropped the masks of no man and humble stranger. He looked at the court and declared, I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. The hall was spellbound as he recounted his entire epic journey. He told them of the Cyclones, the Lotus Eaters, and the Cyclops. He spoke of his affair with Circe, his journey to the land of the dead to speak with Tiresias, and the horror of passing Scylla and Charybdis. He confessed his crew's fatal mistake with the cattle of the sun god, and his lonely 7-year imprisonment on Calypso's island. He laid his entire soul bare, and the Phaeacians, these men who lived in a land untouched by war or hardship, listened in profound awe and pity. When he finished, there was no doubt. They weren't just helping a stranger. They were helping one of the greatest heroes of their age. King Alcinous ordered his men to load a ship with treasures for Odysseus, more wealth than he had even won at Troy. They prepared their fastest, most magical ship. The next day, Odysseus bid a heartfelt farewell to the kind Princess Nausicaa and her parents. He boarded the Phaeacian vessel, and as it pulled away from the shore, a deep magical sleep fell over him. It was a sleep unlike any other, a gift from the gods, still, silent, and dreamless, wiping away the memory of a decade of pain. The ship cut through the waves, faster than a falcon in flight, guided not by stars but by destiny itself. It was carrying a man who had been to the end of the world and back. It was carrying a king, and it was pointed directly, unerringly, toward the shores of Ithaca. He was finally going home. But the man sleeping on the deck had no idea that Poseidon's rage had not been fully quenched, and he had no idea that the home he remembered, the kingdom he fought for, was now a viper's nest, occupied by over 100 arrogant suitors, all trying to marry his wife and steal his throne. He was about to wake up not as a returning king, but as a stranger in his own land, facing a war not on a foreign shore but in his own house. And so the master of disguise, the man of twists and turns, was given one final role to play by his divine protector, Athena. She touched him with her staff, and the hero vanished. In his place stood a withered old beggar, skin wrinkled like a raisin, draped in filthy rags, leaning heavily on a wooden staff. This was his key. This pathetic disguise was his ticket into his own home, a way to walk among his enemies, to see with his own eyes the depth of their depravity, and to sort the loyal from the treacherous. His first test of loyalty came not from a person but from a dog. Lying on a pile of dung, neglected and infested with ticks, was Argos, the puppy Odysseus had trained himself 2 decades ago. As the old beggar approached, the dog's ears twitched. He recognized his master's scent, his master's soul beneath the rags and the magic. He couldn't stand, but he thumped his tail weakly on the ground, a final act of devotion. Odysseus, seeing his faithful friend in such a state, had to turn away to hide a tear. He couldn't give himself away, not yet. And as he walked into the palace, Argos, having finally seen his master home, let out his last breath. It was a heartbreaking omen. The old faithful world was dying, and a new one would have to be born in blood. Inside the great hall, the stench of arrogance was overwhelming. The suitors, over 100 of them, were feasting, drinking, and wasting his fortune. They saw the old beggar enter and immediately began to mock him. The ringleader, a cruel man named Antinous, sneered at the old man, refusing him even a crust of bread. When Odysseus rebuked him for his lack of hospitality, Antinous grabbed a wooden footstool and hurled it, striking Odysseus squarely in the back. The hero stood firm, not even flinching, but inside, his rage simmered like a volcano. He was taking names. He was making a list. Every insult, every blow was a nail in their coffins. In secret, Odysseus revealed himself to his son, Telemachus. The young man, who had only known his father through stories, was now face to face with the living legend. There, in a dusty storeroom, the two plotted their vengeance. Their plan was simple and brutal. Telemachus would hide the suitors' weapons, all the swords and shields that lined the walls of the great hall. When the time was right, they would spring the trap. Father and son, back to back, against 100 men. But there were others who saw through the disguise. As the old nurse Euryclea was washing the beggar's feet, a customary act of hospitality, her hands traced a familiar jagged scar on his thigh. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the scar from the boar hunt, the one he got as a boy. Her eyes shot up wide with recognition. Before she could cry out his name, Odysseus's hand clamped over her mouth, his eyes blazing with a silent, desperate command. "Be silent," he whispered, "or you will destroy us all." She nodded, tears of joy and fear streaming down her face. The secret was safe, but the palace was becoming a powder keg. The final piece was set by Penelope herself. Wise, weary, and clever, she felt a strange connection to this mysterious beggar. She spoke with him, testing his knowledge, and he spun a tale so convincing, so full of details about her long-lost husband, that she wept. Driven by some final desperate hope, she announced a challenge to the suitors. She would bring out Odysseus's great bow. Whoever could string it, and then shoot an arrow clean through the heads of 12 axes lined in a row, would win her hand in marriage. The suitors laughed. This was a game, a final victory lap before one of them claimed the throne. The great bow was brought out, a monstrous thing of wood and horn that no ordinary man could bend. One by one the suitors tried. They strained, their faces turning purple, their muscles bulging, but the bow would not yield. They greased it with fat, they warmed it by the fire, but it was no use. The weapon of a hero would not suffer the touch of these lesser men. Then the beggar spoke. His voice, frail and raspy, echoed in the silent hall. "Let me try," he said. The suitors erupted in laughter and scorn. An old man, a piece of human garbage, wanted to try where they had failed. But Telemachus, playing his part, insisted. "Let the old man have his turn. It is only a bit of sport." The beggar took the bow. He handled it with a familiarity that stunned the room into silence. He didn't strain or grunt. He held it like a musician holding a lyre, testing the string, plucking it until it hummed a low, ominous note. In one fluid, effortless motion, he bent the bow and slipped the string into its notch. The suitors' faces went pale. He then took an arrow, nocked it, and without even rising from his stool, drew the string back to his ear. The arrow flew, a blur of bronze and feather, straight through the holes of all 12 axes, embedding itself in the wall behind them. A clap of thunder, a sign from Zeus, shook the palace. Odysseus shed his rags. He stood tall, no longer a beggar but a king, his eyes burning with 20 years of repressed fury. "The contest is over," he snarled, his voice now a deep, terrifying growl. He nocked another arrow, but this time he didn't aim for the axes. He aimed for a man. Antinous, the cruelest of them all, was just lifting a cup of wine to his lips. The arrow struck him in the throat, and the cup fell from his hands as he crashed backward, his lifeblood mixing with the spilled wine on the floor. Panic erupted. The suitors scrambled for their weapons, but the walls were bare. Telemachus had done his job. "You dogs!" Odysseus bellowed, his voice the roar of a lion. "You thought I'd never make it home from Troy. You devoured my house, forced yourselves on my serving women, and courted my wife while I was still alive. Your time is up. The reckoning has come." What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Odysseus, Telemachus, and 2 loyal servants, armed and positioned by the doors, were a force of nature. Arrows flew with deadly precision, finding throats, chests, and eyes. When the arrows ran out, they used swords and spears. The great hall became a bloodbath, the suitors trapped like rats, their arrogant pleas for mercy met only with cold, hard steel. For hours the carnage raged until the last suitor lay dead, their bodies piled like fish in a net. Justice, brutal and absolute, had been served. But one trial remained, perhaps the most difficult of all. He stood before Penelope, covered in the grime and gore of battle, but she did not run into his arms. 20 years of false hope and cunning liars had made her heart as guarded as a fortress. She looked at this stranger, this warrior, with suspicion. Was this truly her husband, or some god playing a cruel trick? She decided to test him. "Move our marriage bed out into the hall for him," she commanded a servant, her eyes locked on Odysseus. This was the final key. Odysseus's fury, which had just been spent on his enemies, now turned to anguish. "Woman," he cried out, "what have you said? Who has moved my bed? No mortal man could move that bed. I built it myself from the trunk of a living olive tree that grew in the courtyard. I built our bedroom around that tree, and carved the bedpost from its very core. It is rooted in the earth." He had revealed their deepest secret, a truth only the 2 of them could ever know. Penelope's defenses crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. This was him. This was her husband. The long wait was over. The hero had finally truly come home. His journey was complete, not when he set foot on Ithaca, not when he slaughtered his enemies, but in this moment, in the arms of his wife, in the house he had built, by the bed rooted in the earth. He would go on to reunite with his aging father, Laertes, and with Athena's help, bring a final lasting peace to his kingdom. But the Odyssey, the epic tale of wandering, had found its end. For Odysseus had learned the ultimate lesson, that the greatest prize is not glory on a battlefield, but a home to return to, and the love that waits for you there.